Joseph Campbell, Romance of the Grail, The Magic and Mystery of Arthurian Myth. Chapter 1. Neolithic, Celtic, Roman, and German backgrounds. The high period of the Arthurian romances is exactly that of the building of the cathedrals, the wonderful century from 1150 to 1250 AD. In my view, this period, Gothic times, is the counterpart to the Homeric period. We have two great Europes, the Europe of Greece and Rome, and the Europe of the Celts and Germans. The stress is on the individual not as the subject of the state, but as a citizen of the state being a vehicle of his or her will. This is a European mindset. There have been moments in history when, on this little peninsula of European consciousness, in the field of the great Eurasian African world mass, the individual has stood forth. In the Greek understanding of what happened at Marathon and Thermopylae, you already have the Greeks appreciating themselves as very different from the whole Orient. There was enormous respect for the Egyptians, but they were Oriental. And in the Orient, you don't have individuals. You have people of certain types, certain memberships, certain races, certain strata of society. The principle of Dharma, and of what Yeats called the primary mask, both of which are put on you by the society, relieve the individual of personal responsibility. This is the attitude of the soldier. A good soldier is not responsible for what he does. He is responsible for how well he does it, and that's the attitude of Oriental life. When a draft comes along and a Western individual becomes a soldier, very often he has a terrific psychological crisis to face, because he has to move into another order of virtue, where there are no individuals, but only agents of an impersonal order. Of course, no one is responsible for the order, either, because that comes down from the ancestors. So no one is responsible for anything, and you have an absolutely cold-blooded situation. Once when I was in Bombay, I asked a gentleman out on the street the way to the post office, and he pointed it out to me. I said, "Thank you very much." He said, "Oh, it's just my duty," and walked on. I thought, holy God, wouldn't you expect to get a more human response to a little question like that? An Oriental religion swept into Europe with real force at the end of the 4th century, namely Christianity, with all humankind inheriting Adam's sin, and all humankind possibly saved by Jesus' deed, with no individual doing anything on his own. The sin wasn't yours in the first place, nor was the salvation. This became the official state religion of the whole of the Roman Empire. People weren't allowed to think anything else. A century or so later, of course, the European portion of the Roman Empire collapsed, and what we called Rome from then on is really Constantinople, which is Byzantium, which is Asia again. So this totally alien point of view was imposed on Europe. Europe had perfectly good religions and mythologies, and then this other thing was brought in on top of it. And what you got then, in the creative life in Europe throughout the Middle Ages, was an attempt on the part of the European mind to assimilate this Levantine emphasis on the collective and translate it into something like European thinking. In my view, the pinnacle of that achievement is the moment represented in the Arthurian romances, written down in the 12th and 13th centuries. In these works, you have a Christian vocabulary, but completely European forms of consciousness. In the later 13th century, however, after the establishment of the Inquisition, we hear very little of new creative productions in the spirit of the Arthurian romances. We find rewritings of them, translations of them, and so forth. The most important for the English-speaking world being Malory's Morte d'Arthur. But there's no more important creativity after about 1230 AD. The roots of this European consciousness go very deep. There has been a recent correction of the carbon-14 datings for Europe that has pushed some of the datings back quite far, so that the emergence of civilized consciousness in Europe in the period of the Great Goddess is now being dated something like 7000 BC. This is very, very early. The development of agricultural life in Europe is as early as anything taking place in the Near East. And then we have in Eastern Europe a very important development, There may have been a kind of linear writing, a linear script invented. There are a couple of signs of this, in which case it would have been 3,000 years earlier than the Sumerian writing. And then in Western Europe, you have the emergence of the great megalithic systems. Stonehenge and Woodhenge in England and Newgrange in Ireland, and the megaliths all over the Karnak area in Brittany and down into Spain. It's a tremendous development and may go back as far as 4000 BC. That's earlier than the pyramids by far. The pyramids were of the 4th dynasty, beginning with the Step Pyramid of around 2600 BC. The importance, then, of this antiquity of Europe must be recognized, and it's the past chiefly of the goddess. What we find is that the basic mythologies of the European consciousness were those of the goddess from perhaps as early as the pre-ceramic Neolithic on to the later Bronze Age. In Cornwall, there were tin mines. In Ireland, there was gold floating free in the River Liffey, so one could pan for it. Wherever there was tin in the Bronze Age, there would be an important exploiting colony, because tin was an important ingredient of bronze and is not found in very many places. And so, from an early time, the Irish Sea area, Dublin and Wales, and Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and Western Scotland, was a matrix of civilized living. This is the background of the Celtic mythologies, and it is the background also of the prominence and power of the goddess figure in these mythologies. Our fairy godmothers, for instance, are reflexes of all that. About the 1st millennium BC, the Celts begin to come into the British Isles and Western France. Now, the Celts are an Indo-European people. The Indo-Europeans have their beginning in the southwest Russian steppe north of the Black Sea. They're called the Kurgan people, Kurgan being a Russian word for mound burial. And these mound burials, which are the mound burials of warrior chieftains, are the characteristic symptoms of the extent and period of the Indo-Europeans' early diffusions. Their culture extended in 2 directions from that area, one southeastward and the other southwestward. Southeastward, they go into India as the Indo-Europeans. They are Vedic people with their warrior chieftains and their cattle herds. These are the people who had mastered the horse and become thereby almost invincible. The horse and the war chariot are the counterparts of the atom bomb today. Ancient people just couldn't do anything about them. These tribes overrode and overran and took charge. Before that time, with the separation of peoples, everyone was going on foot, and peoples would go apart and become very closely linked with the landscape of their new land. With this emergence of the horse, we begin to have significant intercourse back and forth, almost like what's happening now with the airplane. People who formerly had been separated from each other suddenly came into relationship, and we see cross-references, and as a result, the sometimes startling parallels between what we find in the Celtic world and the Chinese world. But they are really not too surprising because there is this back-and-forth relationship. Of the various Indo-European peoples and groups moving out of these centers, one of the most important for the West was the Celtic community, and the original area of its constellation was Southeast Europe, in the area of Bavaria and Austria. At that place and time, 1000 BC, they were part of what is called the Hallstatt culture, with their heavy wagons, very like the Conestoga wagons that went across the American plains in the 19th century. When the Celts went into Western France, a new brilliance came into the culture, known as Latin culture. We find evidence of these brilliant chariot warriors in their glorious gold work with the clean, graceful designs. They were a group of ruthless barbarians, but with glorious metal artists. And it was a group of these people who in various waves moved into the British Isles and over into Ireland. The earlier Bronze Age inhabitants of the British Isles were mother right people, matrilineal in their descent, with the right to rule passing down from mother to daughter, and the actual governing being done by the Queen's brother. In the Arthurian romances, notice the multitude of important uncle-nephew relationships. The Celts, however, were patriarchal and vigorously so. As they moved from Bavaria to France to Great Britain and then to Ireland, the patriarchal accent became less and less emphatic and the continuation of the female accent more and more perceptible, so that by the time you get to Ireland and Wales, the mother goddesses are still the most powerful. The typical Celtic story dating from those periods is in the style and spirit of a legend of the Celtic fairyland. The people of the Sidhe transformed into the ladies and knights of an enchanted castle. The rules of their disenchantment being known to the knights and ladies themselves, but not to the one who is expected to arrive one day and release them. The tales are of a young, patriarchal warrior type led astray by following some animal or will-o-wisp until he comes to a fairy hill, into which the old mother goddess people have retreated since the arrival of the patriarchal invaders, and the queen of the fairy hill becomes his mistress. When he arrives there, he finds the queen in distress. The people of another fairy hill are harassing her, and he becomes her champion and stays with her. And when his work is done, he remains with the fairy queen of the hill in a state of bliss, as in Wagner's Tannhauser in Venusberg, where the centuries pass as years and there is neither old age, nor sorrow, nor death, nor even boredom. And if by chance he should leave, to return for a brief visit to the historical world, he will have been warned to remain on his magical horse and not to set foot on the ground. In fact, of course, he generally does precisely what he was forbidden to do, and immediately he crumbles to dust and disappears. Such was the fate of one of the members of Bran's company, who returns from the Isle of Women, such also of St. Brendan, when, after a season of only 40 days in the land of promise, he returns to Ireland, where he immediately dies and, of course, goes straight to heaven. This becomes a major motif in the later Arthurian romances, and we'll see it time and time again, in which the hero befriends and defends the chatelaine, the lady of a besieged castle, and becomes her consort. This old Celtic Bronze Age theme, combining the male powers and the female, has come rolling right down through the ages. When you start looking at the entry of Neolithic people into Europe, you find the urn burial people and the bell urn people, one kind after another. Identifying these different peoples who come over into Europe and over into the British Isles becomes extremely complicated. There are almost certainly very important Mediterranean continuities connected with the trans-European Bronze Age tin trade. Irish gold and Irish bronze were distributed all through Europe. In the Hellenistic period, we find the beautifully carved figure of the dying Gaul. This naked Gaelic warrior is wearing an Irish torque in Turkey. A torque is a kind of necklace with two big heavy heads meeting. The trade was strong between the British Isles and the mainland. There were always connections by sea between Spain and Ireland. When he arrived in Gaul, Caesar remarked that the seacoast people had a trade running up and down the coast, trade in gold, trade in tin, trade in bronze, and so forth, which must have come from the islands. So we have the Neolithic Bronze Age Britons with their matrilineal ascent. Next came these people from the Black Sea, the patrilineal Celts, who swept in, with a stopover in southern Europe, during the first millennium BC, up through as late as 50 BC. What happens next, of course, is that all of Gaul is divided into 3 parts. Julius Caesar fought the Gallic Wars, and the Romans conquered France. Then shortly after Caesar's time, the Romans conquered Britain. The conquest of Britain you can date to roughly 50 BC, and it lasted until around 450 AD. So there were 500 years of Roman occupation of what we now call England. Then it was Britain. The Roman occupation reached as far as what we now call Scotland and westward almost into Wales. That left Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and Ireland as territory that was outside the Roman conquest, but subject to Roman influences. Meanwhile, the Germans were piling up in northern Europe. The Germans were another group of Indo-Europeans, but they settled somewhat eastward and northward of the Celts. The German culture was similar to the Celtic one, and their languages were closely related. They were both varieties of the Indo-European complex. At the same time, the Persians were pressing in on the east. The extent of the Roman Empire is almost impossible to imagine. It was enormous, encompassing the whole of North Africa, Europe, and the Near East, to the very borders of Persia. There were Roman roads right across Persia, and there was a Roman trading station on the border of China. We have a text called The Periplus of the Erathian Sea, which is the logbook of a Greek mariner sailing Roman ships in the Indian Ocean. His principal trade route was from Egypt through the Red Sea, down the whole coast of Africa to Mozambique, and westward and eastward, south of Arabia to India. There was a Roman trading station south of Madras on the east coast of India at a place called Arika Medu, dating from around the same time as the invasion of Britain, and Roman coins have been found in Vietnam and in the Philippines. It's incredible, the power and majesty of the empire at its height. This whole empire became Christian in the 4th century AD with the emperors Theodosius I and II. Theodosius I, from 379 to 395, declared Christianity to be the only permitted religion, thus beginning persecutions throughout the empire. For us, the important thing is the missionization taking place in that early period of the British Isles. Great Britain became Christian, along with the rest of the empire, and with the legendary St. Patrick, Ireland became Christian in the 5th century. One of the paradoxical calamities of Christianity was that after Rome was Christianized, it fell. The whole point, really, of St. Augustine's City of God is, yes, the city of man has fallen, but the city of God had triumphed. Well, that was small comfort. The fact was that the place collapsed. The Christians were comparable, I would say, to the communists in our part of the world today. They were eating it out from the inside, like maggots. Agree to disagree. At the same time, the Germans were pressing down from the north, and this pressure became emphatic when Attila the Hun came smashing in from the east, and one German tribe after another was pushed westward, and just out of terror, you might say, broke down through the Roman Empire. With that happening in the 5th century, the Romans had to retrench and shorten their lines. The whole Roman defense line up the Danube to Britain was pulled back, and they pulled their troops out of England. That left England, after 500 years of Roman occupation, like an oyster with the shell taken off. And what begins to happen is that the Picts from the north began pushing down, while the Celts from the west began pushing in, and the Germans came into England from Jutland. There's a long story here of the collapse of British rule in what then became England, but it is that moment, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, the invasions up and down the line by the Germanic tribes, and the inadequate defenses of the Celtic people in Britain, that is the background of the Arthurian legend.